And I thought maybe a good place to start is the Crusades themselves. What are the Crusades? What happens in order to invigorate the Christians to come, or these Crusaders specifically, to come to Jerusalem? And what are the Muslims doing in that movement as well?
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. You actually ask a very, very difficult question, because I don't think there's really ever a clear answer what the Crusades, what the origin of the Crusades was, or what the aim was. There are many, many interpretations, and I think Dr. Salman will probably have some ideas about that. The interesting thing about the Crusades is that they emerge really, there are many, many Crusades, and although we often look at the Crusades as being the primary aim of which is, of course, Jerusalem, the recovery of Jerusalem, if you look at the original sources and the primary sources, this is not clear really from the start. And one has to look at, for example, just to give, I know it's not a history lesson, but if the Crusades were 1098, just to give you an understanding, there were 10 years before that, there were Crusades taking place in Andalusia, in Iberia. The fall of Toledo in 1085, for example, was something which caused a huge seismic shock. The first time the Muslims lost land was in Toledo. So one has to look at the Crusades on a much more general picture than simply what was taking place. Why they came is a question, is an open question, is a long question, which we can debate some other time. But what's interesting was the impact they had on the Muslim land. They were, in the words of a contemporary Muslim historian, a strange and unexpected enemy. There had been many, well, first one has to remember, of course, that there were many, many, many Christians living among the Muslim world at that time. There were constant raids coming in from the Byzantine Empire, which was constantly raiding the Muslim empire at that time. But what was taking place with the Crusades when they first emerged in the late sort of 1090s was something completely different. They were coming, they were organized, they were coming to stay, they were coming from what is now modern Europe, from the French, from France, from Germany. They were organized, they were coming because of a papal decree, and it took the Muslims a long time to figure this out. They were used to people raiding, they were used to people coming on seasonal campaigns, but they couldn't quite figure out what was happening here. And I would say it took the Muslims, and of course they marched down, they massacred everyone, Jerusalem fell. And of course the once they captured Jerusalem, they massacred not just the Muslims, but also the Jews who had been living with the Muslims for many, many years. And until then, and we can talk about the fragmentation of the Islamic world at that time, I would say it took the Muslims a good 30 to 40 years for them to understand what was happening. That this enemy was not going to leave, they were going to stay, they were planning to occupy more and more territory. They had developed their own Latin kingdoms across the area. And of course, one of the main issues that we will talk about is the fact that there was no real Muslim voice which was responding to the Crusades. The Caliph at the time, Islam was ruled nominally by a Caliph who lived and resided in Baghdad. But the Caliph had no armies. Caliph was symbolically an important figure, of course. He led the prayer, he created a certain cloak of legitimacy for Muslim rule, but he had no military power. The military power was in the control of certain warlords, the Seljuks, the famous Seljuks, of course, in Baghdad. But we also have to remember that this was a time when Islam, the Muslim world, had three caliphs. There wasn't just one caliph, there were three caliphs. We had what we call the Sunni caliph in Baghdad, and of course this is something we can talk about later, what it meant to be Sunni and Shia at that time. In Egypt, we had the Fatimid caliph, who actually was established in really with the aim of countering the caliphate in Baghdad ideologically, politically. And we have to always remember that perhaps the most famous Islamic learning institution, Al-Azhar, was actually established as a Fatimid Ismaili center of propagation. And it turned out, of course, having a different destiny. But of course, there was a third caliph, and that was the caliph in Al-Andalus, who were basically the Umayyads who had fled after the Abbasid coup. So you had a Muslim world which had three caliphs, was fragmented into a myriad of warlords, of provinces, and who were oblivious to the threat that was actually coming from Europe. So Jerusalem was captured very quickly. The Latin kingdoms in the area were established reasonably without much opposition. And then we have these anecdotes, and of course it's always, one reads anecdotes with a certain skepticism about the Muslims crying and wailing and tearing their clothes and saying, oh, woe is us, going to Baghdad and pleading with the caliph to send armies. And in one incident, the caliph was more interested in his new bride than he was in the jihad. And of course one reads this, and we have to always remember one thing about history. History needs to be read forwards, not backwards. And it's so easy now because we know what happened to say, oh, you see, it's a good narrative. The Muslims were fragmented, the Muslims became united, Jerusalem was recaptured. And this is something which, yes, there's a truth to that, but we can also challenge that narrative. And I think we will challenge that narrative today to provide a much more subtle, a much richer, and a much more nuanced history. So before I ask maybe Dr. Salman to comment on this, I think to just quickly summarize a fragmented Muslim world, different allegiances, very much inward-looking. And in fact, the inward-looking nature of the Muslim world then will eventually prove to be its savior and its success, because it's this inward-looking where the Sunni revival emerges. The Sunni revival emerged not because of the Crusades. It was independent of that. And while the Muslims were inwardly looking and reviving their own and solidifying their own belief system and their own the madrasas, the theology, and so forth, the Crusades were taking. These were two separate events, and one needs to keep that in mind. If I may, just one final point before we discuss. A reasonably, I wouldn't say controversial, but something which makes you think. I'd like to challenge the narrative that the Crusades actually mattered. Today we talk about the Crusades and everybody's up in arms in the Crusades, and Salahuddin liberated Jerusalem and saved Islam, the Crusades, wa akhirih. And of course there's truth to that. There's no denying there's truth to that. Far more impactful on the Muslim world nations than the Crusades. The Crusades arrived in the Holy Lands, in Palestine, in Syria, and they only ever occupied a strip of land from the coast. And the only land they occupied was Edessa, and of course Jerusalem. The other possessions were all on the coast. They made no inward advances in the Muslim world. If you lived in Baghdad, you never ever interacted with any of the Crusades. The big cities, Damascus, Aleppo, to a large extent Cairo, the big heartland Muslim cities, yeah, you may have come across them, but there was no real interaction between them and that. Intellectually, socially, economically, the Muslims had very little interaction with the Crusades and the French. And this actually leads to an interesting point, which we can touch on, which is the political fragmentation of the Muslims was not mirrored by an intellectual fragmentation, perhaps that we see today. One of the most striking things about Islam today and the Muslims today is the loss of confidence, the loss of center, a certain disequilibrium. The Muslims in those days were totally confident of themselves. They looked at these people, they didn't want to mix with them, or if they mixed with them, they mixed with them on their own terms. And there's a very interesting memoir written at that time, a contemporary memoir by Osama ibn Muqith, who writes about this and how slowly, as the French came and settled, they were basically civilized by the Muslims. They taught them how to clean themselves, they taught them about food, and whenever they'd meet Osama, there's a famous anecdote where one of the French invites him to come and said, oh, you've got to come and eat at my house. And he said, oh, don't worry, my cook is Egyptian, we don't have pork in our house anymore. So as the cultural amalgamation took place, a lot of these people came from Europe noticed a very, very sophisticated, profound civilization. And of course, Salahuddin embodies that, and that's something we can talk about. But maybe Dr. Salman.
I just want to mention we have a Mongol historian in the audience at the moment, so maybe he could comment on some of the points about the Mongols. But maybe Shaykh Salman, the same question, but maybe you could touch on, like Dr. Azzam did, about the modern age and the current fragmentation and how it's a bit different, maybe too.
Just before I do that, I think just to give people a perspective about what Dr. Azzam is saying, I think there are two important points that Dr. Azzam mentions. One is there is fragmentation that exists in the Muslim world at that time. And that fragmentation allows the Crusaders to gain the upper hand. And that's why a lot of historians, they say that if the Crusaders had arrived 10, 15 years earlier, they would have never succeeded in their mission. Because in 1092, you have Malik Shah passes away, he's the great Sultan of the Seljuk Empire. You have Nizam al-Mulk passes away in 1092. In 1094 or 5, I believe.
Assassinated, right?
Yeah, he was assassinated by the assassins.
Into them in due course.
Yeah, but what ends up, the reason why the Crusaders are so easily able to embed themselves in Bilad al-Sham is because they're really just seen as just another principality, just another lord that's governing amongst a whole bunch of other lords in Bilad al-Sham. And so one of the reasons why the Crusaders are able to succeed, when they get to Iznik, which is, they come from Constantinople, they get into Nicaea or Iznik, and Qilij Arslan, at that point, has kind of set up his own shop in Anatolia. He seceded from the greater Seljuk Empire, and he's kind of busy fighting his enemies, who are also Muslims, the Danishmends, in the east of Anatolia. He actually ends up winning his first battle against the Crusaders. But this is the People's Crusade. So the Crusaders, you have the People's Crusade and you have the Prince's Crusade. The People's Crusaders are just peasants. They're just like, they're farmers, peasants, they have some religious zeal. They come to Nicaea, they get annihilated by Qilij Arslan. And what does he do? He goes right back to fighting the Danishmends. And so when the Prince's Crusades arrives, and they're much more formidable, they're actually the knights and the lords of Europe, he is not able to defeat them. And that gives them sort of an open road to Antioch and then down the coast. But what happens is when the Crusaders actually reach Antioch and these other places, they find an atmosphere which is very conducive to either making some sort of alliances with other Muslim lords, or actually signing treaties with other Muslim lords that kind of opens the pathway somewhat to their march to Jerusalem.
Alliances with Crusaders.
So for example, when you get to Antioch, Yaghisian is the lord of Antioch, and he kind of pleads for help from Damascus and these other places. And they're kind of not very forthcoming when it comes to giving him assistance. And when finally a relief army does come to Antioch to help this person, he's died actually already. But when they come to relieve Antioch, the internal divisions amongst the lords that constitute that particular army are so severe that they're actually not able to mount an effective counterattack against them. But down the coast entirely, if you look at, even outside the coast, if you look at places like Azaz, Shazar, Tripoli, Jalal al-Mulk, they're all striking deals with the Crusaders, which is quite reflective, I think, of what we see in modern times, which is you have a lot of states who have either particularly, they have normalized relations with the state of Israel, or they're looking to normalize relations with the state of Israel. And so it's not entirely the same, but disunity has always been kind of a central theme when identifying the success of the Crusaders themselves. But on Dr. Azzam's point, it seems like that political fragmentation isn't actually reflected on the kind of the grassroots, social, intellectual level, right? When we think of this period, Al-Ghazali dies after the taking of Jerusalem. And he's considered the mujaddid of the era. He's considered one of the greatest ulama that our community, our ummah was able to produce. And so there almost seems to be this two different worlds. The political world is like this one world, and then what's happening on the ground with the Sunni revival is an entirely different world. And this idea of fragmentation actually continues even well into the period of Salahuddin. I mean, Salahuddin doesn't just come about and, he just has religious zeal and he aims straight for Jerusalem to take it over. He actually has a repentance story. And Nuruddin has a repentance story as well. And Al-Qadi al-Fadl actually, in 1185, after Salahuddin falls like really ill, this is seen as like one of the turning points in his lifetime. Al-Qadi al-Fadl, who's a very close associate of Salahuddin, makes him take a vow that you're not going to fight Muslims anymore. Now is the time. You've taken Antioch, you've consolidated your power. Now is the time to look towards Jerusalem and finally fulfill, I guess, the mission that we've all been aspiring to for these past several decades.
I mean, you brought this. We went from the Crusades, Salahuddin, now in 1185. So maybe if I backtrack slightly, let's talk about the Sunni revival. And you wrote a book about it. So maybe you're the person to ask this question too. What like this point that Dr. Salman has made about this dichotomy between the military, political realm, and then what's happening socially and intellectually on the ground. What is happening socially and intellectually on the ground? And maybe some of the names and figures that are going to play a big role.
As I was listening now to Dr. Salman, and I'm thinking about the fragmentation, you come to realize eventually that the fragmentation of the Muslim world is not the exception, but it's the norm. I think fragmentation is the norm. And I think we get sidetracked by fragmentation. And to give just one example of, I think it was in 1259 that Ulugh Beg established the Maraga Observatory and appointed Nasruddin Tusi. And if one says that, says, that's fine, 1259. But we all know what happened in 1258, 1 year earlier, when the Mongols ransacked Baghdad and, killed all the Muslims. So you do realize that there's actually two histories being spoken about here. And that our focus on the political history often blinds us to a more profound, more subtle and more nuanced ideological history which is taking place. And we find this all the time in Islamic history. Look at the Mamluk period where they were literally killing each other on a daily basis while the Mamluk civilization was absolutely flowering. So looking back to the Sunni revival, I think Salman mentioned the hero of the story. And if the story has a hero, it's not really Salahuddin. Salahuddin is the child of the Sunni revival. He was a very faithful child, he was a very obedient child. But Salahuddin was not the genius that brought this together. His virtue, his chivalry, his honor, his bravery are absolutely astonishing. We're going to touch on that. And he is the hero of the story. But the real genius behind all this, I believe, was a man called Nizam al-Mulk, the great Seljuk vizier. And it was Nizam al-Mulk who, of course, was the patron of al-Ghazali. And as you said, the debt that Muslims owe to al-Ghazali is almost immeasurable. And I think that he is truly Hujjat al-Islam. Nizam al-Mulk realized something quite early on, and that was that the fragmentation, the ideological fragmentation that was taking place, and this is what's interesting, was going to tear the Muslim world apart. He observed a Baghdad that was completely driven, and the strife in Baghdad was very much driven, partly, as I mentioned, by the Ismaili Shia attacks that were coming in from Egypt. And we have to remember that there was a period of time when Baghdad itself was occupied by a Shia dynasty, the Buyids. So there was a threat, an ideological threat that was coming from Ismailism against what it meant to be a Muslim, what it meant to be a Sunni Muslim. But he also observed that the fragmentation that was taking place within the madhahib. And the dispute, especially between the Hanbali madhabs and the other madhahib, was actually not one that was being conducted in the mosques and the madrasas, but was actually conducted in violence on the streets and was causing enormous bloodshed. And we have famous stories, of course, where this imam, I can't remember his name, even his madhab, but it's a good example. He was giving his khutbah, and in the mosque, a dog walks into the mosque by mistake, says, oh no, dogs pray with the Hanafis, so dogs with the Hanbalis. And that's again and again a kind of trope that appears in Islamic sources. And Nizam al-Mulk saw all this, and Ghazali, to his credit, saw all this. And he realizes that this cannot continue. And here we're talking about something which is totally parallel to the Crusades. Inward looking, emerging initially from Nishapur in the east, but finding its real voice in Baghdad. And then, of course, the heartbeat of Islam moving towards Syria and then ultimately to Egypt. What was needed was the articulation of a Sunni Islam, which was on the one hand orthodox, but on the other hand, like an umbrella, had to be generous enough to protect Muslims who came with different roads or paths to Allah. And this is where Ghazali's genius is. His Ihya Ulumuddin is a remarkable piece of unity of Islam. He understood. Ghazali was not, like people say, against philosophy and his whole debate with Ibn Rushd and all that. He understood philosophy. Ghazali was a brilliant philosopher. But he understood that philosophy had certain limitations, that one can use it to an extent, but that in itself was not going to be enough to take people to the ultimate truth, because it was only used by certain people in certain conditions. Al-Ghazali himself understood the importance of tasawwuf, Sufism, which he again said, this is important because there's something in the human soul which has a personal yearning to Allah and it wants to reach Allah through that way. Ghazali understood the importance of kalam. He understood the importance of theology. And here I'm aware that I'm sitting with a great scholar in fiqh and kalam, and we'll talk about, I'm not in any way a theologian. I'm a historian. And slowly he began to articulate this new orthodoxy. This Sunni orthodoxy that was emerging as a response to the Ismaili threat. And I think the one needs to understand that the Azhar was propagating an Ismaili doctrine, and the Sunnis, being the majority, were not in a way responding. But when they began to understand the threat, they realized that this is something that we need to articulate, we need to capture in a certain format that people can actually know what it means to be a Sunni Muslim. Because it was a time when you're either Shia or you're something else. And that's when the Sunni definition of what it meant to become a Sunni started to emerge. And what really emerges is a orthodox triangle, if you could say a triumvirate, of being a member of the madhab. Now, it really didn't matter which madhab you were. It was quite flexible. You're Hanbali or Hanafi or Shafi'i. And there was one gentleman who changed his madhab every little while. And he ended up being, and they used to call him Hanafshi, because of everything. So really, whichever madhab you followed was not really going to be the reason why you're going to, accuse other people of being a kafir. And this was a very important step that one accepted that. That theologically you adopted what was literally has become the Ash'ari kind of school of theology, which is basically middle of the road, moderate version of Islam. That you had some Sufi leanings that was acceptable within the orthodoxy. And that's really the kind of the path that Ghazali was moving towards. Because he understood that if people held very fast to their own strict, narrow definitions, then Islam would end up tearing itself. Now that, in a very simple way, was the combination of a very complex argument. The real genius comes when Nizam al-Mulk, as a statesman, says, this is great, but how are we going to solidify this? How are we going to spread this? How are we going to make this resonate within the Islamic community? What is the glue that's going to hold this together? As a statesman, as realpolitik. And his real contribution to Islamic history was, of course, the madrasas. And we'll stop here and have a debate, but really I would say that the madrasas saved Islam. The madrasas protected Islam in ways which are perhaps not being given the credit. And it is this madrasas which ultimately, initially totally independent of the Crusades, which we can argue actually saved Islam from the Crusades.
I don't know, I think people might be thinking at this point that they've talked a lot, Salahuddin hasn't been born yet, at this moment in time. There's a lot of the background, and I don't think people recognize how important this moment that Dr. Azzam is speaking about is. When historians talk about that Seljuk period, everything you know that is Sunni Islam today happened then. That decision was made in that moment, and that's what we believe today. That the schools of creed are such, that the madhabs are this, and we believe in the schools of tasawwuf. And that is very important. And then the reason I think is very important, like you're mentioning, for Salahuddin Ayubi, is that because he embraces this wholeheartedly. He is a Shafi'i in fiqh, but he respects all the madhabs. He is a very resolute, it seems, Ash'ari in creed, propagates the Ash'ari creed, regardless of what people might say, or because some people say, well, he wasn't really Ash'ari, but he was. There's no denying that. And he believes in tasawwuf. And this is why I think this is very important to set the scene, because if you're going to describe him as a personality, you can't miss these points. These are massively important in defining who he was as a being, as a personality. But maybe, Dr. Salman, we're going to have to, maybe when we come back to you, we'll do the birth of Imam Sultan Salahuddin. But sticking to that point, Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi spends a lot of time spilling ink against the Shia, the Fatimids specifically. There is a strong refutation culture in that he's trying to set what Sunni Islam actually means. And I don't know if that's something you can touch on, this defining of Sunni Islam, especially as it correlates to the modern age. Because, for example, we have religious movements today that are in bed now with certain oppressors to the Muslim cause. And is there now a need again to demarcate that, maybe Madkhalis aren't Sunni? I don't know, I'm just saying, anyone who drinks Starbucks isn't a Sunni. Anyone who drinks Coca-Cola isn't a Sunni. Is there a need now for the renewal of what Sunnism really means in this age, and maybe the importance of what happened then as well?
I think the issue I have with the framing of your question is I think it sets up defining Sunnism in a direction that takes us towards narrowing the boundaries as opposed to expanding them. And I think what Imam al-Ghazali was trying to do was he was trying to expand them. His Faisal al-Tafriqa, that whole book is pretty much just, first of all, expanding the orbit of what it means to be Muslim. And that's the first thing that we need to to establish, because at the end of the day, every single Muslim has particular hukuk that we have to, even as Sunnis, we have to respect. So he was widening the boundaries of what it means to be Muslim, against perhaps earlier discussions where it was very easy for people to anathemize others, even from amongst, for example, the Maturidis sometimes anathemize the Ash'aris, or the Hanbalis are anathemizing others, and there's just like Dr. Azzam mentioned, it's a very, very messy situation. And some people refer to the Sunni revival as kind of the Sunni recentering. It's recentering the idea of what does it mean to exactly be Sunni. I think in the modern period, I think we require more of an approach that makes people comfortable with ambiguity and with plurality than the other way around. I think we tend to think that we are a very pluralistic community, but modernity has in fact made us a little bit more restrictive in terms of our particular imaginations. And even when it comes to, for example, people working with particular regimes of a Shia bent, again, it's not like Salahuddin in the beginning of his career did not agree to work with the Fatimids in some capacity. It's not like Ibn Ruziq, who was the Fatimid vizier, was clamoring to Nuruddin, work with me to fight and launch a united front against Jerusalem. These are coming from the Fatimids. So we have to give credit to where credit is due. I think the main point that I would take away from Dr. Azzam is we don't see the madaris, we don't see the Sufi khanaqahs, we don't see any type of these educational establishments that are meant to produce a type of Islamic consciousness. We don't see the focus being put on those spaces as the solution, or a big part of the solution to the predicament today that Muslims are in. We actually downplay that, and we give primacy to politics, which most of us have no particular influence on anyway, right? It's not like Sisi is listening to us, or any of these rulers are listening to us. And I think we tend to see the madrasa as a space where, the Maulvis are kind of doing their thing, as opposed to seeing it as something that is absolutely necessary to bring back the ummah consciousness the Islamic consciousness that's required for us to come together and then know what needs to be done. When you look at Nuruddin, if you look at all of his entries and all of his praise that people write about him, they always begin with, he did the jihad, and he set up madaris, and he set up Sufi khanqahs. There's a reason why they're focusing on Nuruddin's ability to, inaugurate like 42, 45 madaris in Damascus alone. And so I think that had a huge impact in defining Islam and defining Sunnism to the population. And I still think that we tend to downplay the importance of creating spaces and recognizing that the victory of Islam is always going to be a multi-front victory. It's not just going to be won on the battlefield with Sisi hopefully doing Tawbah one day and changing his mind and deciding to free whatever he wants to free. But there needs to be a grassroots Islam that's in place and that's effective and that has efficacy. And unfortunately, we still have a long way to go in doing that in the UK and in other places of the Muslim world as well.
Jazakallah khair. I think that was an amazing answer. Maybe now we can come to...
Maybe, but I'd like to add, before, we're not going to end up with Salahuddin, are we?
Next week.
If I can make a point about modernity, and I think I know we may come back to it later, but before I forget, I think it's important to understand the context of madrasas and the context of Nuruddin, Salahuddin, Nizam al-Mulk, and the multitude of madrasa building in those days, of course, had a historical context. Today, as Muslims, the biggest threat to Islam today, in my opinion, is the secular atheist outlook. Far more dangerous than any Shia threat, far more dangerous than any other ideological. It's what I call the tyranny of liberalism, which is espoused in a militant atheism. We have never lived in an age throughout history which has actually propagated atheism, ever. You might talk about Hinduism, you might talk about other things. They had their own theology and they believed in that theology, and whether we agree with it or not, they had an eschatology and a theological outlook on life. We are now living in a society which denies the sacred and which insists upon us accepting and adhering that denial. So that's the first point. The second point, we're living in a time when we are literally destroying the environment and the earth in which we live. To me, these two overriding issues have to transcend any internal, theological, judicial, or legal quibbling that we may have with, other people from Madhab or Shia. That we need to unite. And I sincerely and genuinely believe that Muslims have to build bridges with people from other faiths to unite, because there will come a time when those who believe will actually have to confront atheism. So the conclusion of this is that, yes, there has to be a revival. We can talk about that. We can talk about madrasas in the modern world. But it's vitally important to understand the social and intellectual context in which modernity is, and how, in the time of Salahuddin, these issues simply did not exist. People were born and died within a certain spiritual worldview. So their struggles are not our struggles. And so we cannot simply replicate or duplicate what happened before. We need to understand the ideological context in which we are born and which we need to confront. Should we go back to Salahuddin?
Maybe, I don't know, I'll just open-end this question and then you can take it where you want. But because I think doing a piecemeal, he did this, then he did that, and he was born like this, maybe like an overview of Salahuddin Ayubi.
Sure.
Who is he? Why is he so brilliant? Who is his father? Who are the major influences on his life? And then who is he and the personality?
This is just a kind of very quick crib sheet on Salahuddin. He was, we know so little, we know a lot about him, but the general person, if you ask him about Salahuddin, will probably recognize that he was actually a Kurd. He was Kurdish. and this is an important point. He managed to rise and become the most important person in the Muslim world. One could say despite his Kurdish background, and it's because at that time the Turks were in the ascendancy, and the Turkish-Kurdish suspicion was probably, as powerful then as it is now, or perhaps. He was accused of being a dog that barked against his master. He was vilified, and he was born in Tikrit. He grew up with his father, was a man called Najmuddin Ayubi, and Najmuddin and his uncle and Salahuddin's uncle Shirko entered the service of Nuruddin Zengi. Nuruddin is the great champion, the great hero of the story as well, the son of the Imad Zengi. Nuruddin managed to. Really, it is with Nuruddin that we start seeing the first Islamic response to what was happening. Nuruddin was 1140 something, so we've got to keep it in mind. Salahuddin was born in 1136, so Jerusalem had fallen 30 odd years before. He grew up at a time when Jerusalem was under foreign occupation. As a young boy, he lived in Baalbek, and then he lived in Damascus, and as a young boy, he would have, when he was about 10 years old, the Second Crusade attacked Damascus, so he must have grown up in that atmosphere. And the great hero of that time was a man called Nuruddin, who managed to unite Damascus and Aleppo. And it is with Nuruddin that we start seeing the first unified response and what's known as the kind of counter-crusade politically, but also, as Salman said, through his remarkable madrasa building and building of Sufi khanaqahs and his surrounding himself with certain scholars. The established narrative is that as a young man, he gets sent to Egypt, Salahuddin, because Egypt was under the Fatimid rule, and Nuruddin wanted to restore it under Sunni orthodoxy. And so he sends him with his uncle Shirko to Egypt on 2 or 3 different campaigns. And then Shirko dies and Salahuddin becomes the vizier. And it's all given a kind of narrative of a man who was reluctant to reach power, who was against power, and somehow it was forced upon him. A narrative which I fundamentally disagree with. You do not become the vizier of Egypt, you do not rule Egypt just by being a naive kind of ingenue who somehow stumbles himself. Yes, Salahuddin was remarkably lucky. A lot of people around him died at very opportune times. His uncle, the caliph, the Fatimid caliph al-Adid, Nuruddin's son,
Nuruddin himself,
and the Nuruddin's son all died very conveniently, so maybe he was destined. Then there's, of course, this whole controversial thing that he became the vizier of Egypt, but of course Nuruddin was the main ruler. He was under Nuruddin's rule, his camp, and one talks about the tension between these two men, and of course I think this has been overplayed. And Nuruddin then dies, and Salahuddin spends the next 10 years or so trying to unify Syria and Egypt and northern Iraq. And there's a very important reason for that, is because it was very clear that in order to defeat the Latin kingdom, you needed the 3 powers. You cannot defeat the Latin kingdom just with Syria. You cannot defeat it just with Egypt. You needed Mosul, you needed Aleppo, you needed Damascus, you needed Cairo. There had to be a united front. It took him 11 or so years to do so. He did that in a remarkable way, without the spilling of blood, although there was huge resistance, and the assassins tried to kill him on at least 2 occasions. And then we have this whole narrative again of whether he was, fighting the Crusades, not why did he fight them earlier, why did he not do that? Until, of course, he gained his most famous victory, the Battle of Hattin in 1187, and Jerusalem was recovered. And when he did win Hattin, he knew that the West would not allow this to happen, and they unleashed a huge force on him with the Third Crusade, when the kings of France, of England, and of Germany combined forces, and this is the famous Richard the Lionheart, of course. And in the Third Crusade, there's this incredible war of attrition where Salahuddin was trying to hold on to the land that he had won, and he was trying desperately to hold on to Jerusalem, that Jerusalem should not fall back. And he succeeds in the end in holding Jerusalem. Richard leaves and Salahuddin dies broken. Effectively, he's in his 50s, very young, but broken by the sheer ordeal that he had to undergo. Sorry, this is a really very fast speed through. I've done him a huge disservice here.
I don't know if people realize we got to the end. Salahuddin has passed away. You can go home now.
If I could just quickly mention, just zoom in on 2 points over here, that maybe I think is relevant for the audience to note.
Please.
Point number one, it takes almost a century to reclaim Jerusalem. We tend to forget this. This isn't, this is a crusade. This is a Crusader state in the heartland of the Muslim world. It's not like they have any massive technological advantage over the Muslim army. It's not like there's a huge disparity in terms of weaponry. There's not like they have massive amounts of numbers in their favor. But usually, in these types of events, it does take a very, sometimes it takes some time in order for people to get their heads straight and figure out a strategy and a way to achieve victory. The reason why Egypt is so important, the reason why taking of the ports is so important for the Crusaders, is because when you have Egypt, you can intercept, the supplies coming in. When you have the ports, you can receive supplies, you can receive arms. And so strategy is a big part of this. When Salahuddin, when he wins, even when he captures Jerusalem, Richard the Lionheart is not a pushover, right? He's a very, very formidable enemy. He wins a lot of battles, against Salahuddin. We think Salahuddin just won every single battle that he faced. He didn't.
He lost most of them.
He lost most of them, or a lot of them.
He won the one that mattered.
Yeah.
It's like a boxer.
Yeah, basically. But even at the end, at the Treaty of Jaffa, he concedes the coastline to the Crusaders. They still have, he's not able to drive out the Crusaders from the Levant. It's only with, I believe, the Mamluks later on that the Crusaders are driven out of the Levant. And Salahuddin recognized, he's like, look, we're tired, our armies are tired. It wasn't a decision that he wanted because he always had this fear that they could kind of regroup and come back. But it was the pragmatic decision that he had to make. And so strategy is and the reason I say strategy is very important is because there's a benefit in rhetorical resistance, armies to Aqsa. It's good to keep in mind the idea of Aqsa and the fact that we have to defend Aqsa and we have to fight for Aqsa and so on and so forth. But I remember asking one of my Palestinian teachers about, some people were saying, all the Arab states should just open their borders and let people just flood in. And he was like, his exact words were, these are ahlam, and this is ghaba. He was like, these are just airy-fairy dreams, because as a strategic matter, this is not an effective strategy to take. And the Muslims today, the Muslim countries are far more, they're basically vassal states of America. If America stops equipping them with weapons, they're going to lose the battle right on the spot. And so these are kind of long-term strategic decisions that these countries have to make to ensure how can we come to a position where we can actually exercise power in a way that can result in an outcome for Jerusalem. And beyond that, like I said, the rhetorical aspects of this equation are important, but we shouldn't confuse that for the real need to actually have solutions and have a strategy in place. Like right now, we're very, very active. What have we decided after all this dies down? What are we going to do next? What's the strategy? Are we going to start a lobbying organization? Are we still going to vote for the Tories or Labour? What exactly are we going to do? What's our grassroots efforts and movement going forward? Because these things do fizzle out eventually. This is not the first time we've seen a crisis with Gaza. Right? We've seen them over and over again. And the fear of a lot of people who are in this space, even a lot of activists, is once the news cycle moves on in 8 weeks and 10 weeks and whatever it is, that we're just going to settle back into our comfortable spaces and not have come up with a long-term strategy of how we're going to deal with this. Sorry for
If I may just comment on that. And the risk of being, again, just, if not controversial, just to provoke the debate, to argue that the lesson that we can learn from today through Salahuddin's life is historically and ideologically, I would argue that the capture of Jerusalem probably was Salahuddin's third priority, not his primary priority. We talk so much about Jerusalem, the importance of Jerusalem. We all know that. We don't need to keep talking about that. We understand that. But let me ask you a question. What would happen if tomorrow we just woke up and on the news we discover that somehow Netanyahu has crumbled and the Muslim armies have marched in and taken Jerusalem? Of course, there'll be a sense of euphoria for a day or two. But honestly, the struggle that the Muslims have to undertake is far greater than Jerusalem. What matters not if Jerusalem falls, what matters is the Jerusalem which is in our hearts. And that is the lesson that Salahuddin can teach us. Salahuddin had two main priorities, one ideological, one political. Ideological is the role Salahuddin played in the Sunni revival. The years that he spent building madrasas, the relationship he had with the scholars around him, and I can speak about people like Muwaffaq ibn Qudama, Ibn Abi Asrun, Qutb ibn Shapuri, and so forth. There are so many people. The intellectual firmament and milieu in which surrounded Salahuddin, this was the real investment that he made. If he lived through one thing more than Jerusalem, it was to revive and uphold and protect this new Sunni. A seed had been planted. He was aware of that. And that's why all of Salahuddin's family, not just his male members, but all the females around Salahuddin, his wife, his daughters, sisters, all devoted themselves in building madrasas. This was a time when people built madrasas, they did not build mosques. The main investment was in madrasas. One asks why. There is a very interesting point about madrasas, and the real clincher to Salahuddin, of course, was that those graduates, and I use the word graduates very loosely because there was no established curriculum as such, people were coming out with a knowledge of Islamic law, and at the same time they were assuming positions of political authority. The governors, the administrators, the people around Salahuddin, like Bahauddin ibn Shaddad, like, for example, Imad Zeni al-Isfahani, and of course the great Al-Qadi al-Fadil, who was Palestinian, I should say, from Asqalan. He was not a madrasa educated because he grew up under the Fatimids, but Isfahani and Ibn Shaddad were both graduates, if one can use that term, of the Nizamiya madrasa in Baghdad. And when you start seeing a pattern, that not only were these people knowledgeable of Islamic law and fiqh and understood their Islam, but now they were in positions of political, administrative power. This was the pincer movement that sealed Salahuddin's success. To have rulers or administrators who could both understand realpolitik and the need to compromise with an understanding of Islamic fiqh. So if ideologically Salahuddin's greatest achievement was this infusing and this instilling of the Sunni, I'm not sure I even like the term orthodoxy or revival, because they're just terms. The Sunni belief system, the Sunni seeds that he was planting, this was his greatest achievement. His second greatest achievement, I would say, was his restoration of Egypt. Egypt was key. And exactly what Salman is saying, Egypt, the Muslims had to get their act together. And the Crusades and the Christians, the Franks knew this more instinctively, perhaps. The King Amalric, the great Amalric, of course Baldwin, the great, the leper king that he's so famous, who at age 16 defeated Salahuddin. Let's give him credit as well. I mean, these were brave people. We have to give them credit. They were fighting. They understood that what they could not afford was that Egypt and Syria became united. A lesson that has stood throughout history until today. The unification of Syria and Egypt was critical with the armies of Mosul and northern Iraq. And that is why Amalric and the Crusades attacked Egypt again and again and again, and they did not want the Fatimids to fall, and they were supporting this. But again, like Dr. Salman says, it's not black and white. When Egypt was threatened, there were many, including the last Fatimid Caliph, who sent pleading with Nuruddin, come save Egypt. If Egypt were to fall to the Crusades, to the French, this would mean the end. Salahuddin's greatest success was in securing the unification, if one can call that term, of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. As soon as that was done, and this took a long time, Damascus didn't want it, Aleppo didn't want it, the Crusades the French didn't want it, and he had to slowly do that. As soon as that was secure, I would go as far as to say the fall of Jerusalem was inevitable. It was just like a jigsaw puzzle. Had it not been Salahuddin, it would have fallen to somebody else. It could have fallen to Nuruddin, and that is what Nuruddin wanted. Nuruddin succeeded in allying Damascus and Aleppo. He could not get Egypt. As soon as Salahuddin got Egypt, Aleppo ran away because they took Nuruddin's son and they tried to break away. They tried to kill Salahuddin, and this is how we need to interpret those 11 years in which he spent back and forth. So I would say, yes, of course, Jerusalem matters, and we don't need to keep repeating Jerusalem, and our fixation on Jerusalem should not blind us that, what is more important is an intellectual, spiritual revival.
By the way, just to give credit to one person who we're missing out, the first Imad Zeni, who's the father of Nuruddin, he takes Aleppo, right? He's the first person to take Aleppo. He's not able to penetrate to southern Syria because Damascus has an alliance with the Crusaders, and they don't want him to gain advantage. But Imad Zeni is the first breakthrough when it comes to, I guess, concentrating power in northern Syria, and that allows Nuruddin later on to then take Damascus, which then subsequently allows them to penetrate south into Egypt. And when Egypt calls Nuruddin, that's his opening to actually get Shirkuh and Salahuddin in that particular position. So just giving some positive remarks towards Imad Zeni as well.
Yes, but Imad Zeni was not Nuruddin or Salahuddin. Imad Zeni was an extremely violent man who would crucify people who disagreed with you. But he was the first face of Islamic resistance. He's the first one who said, enough. You make a very interesting point. I'll just very briefly touch on it. 88 years passed between the fall of Jerusalem and the recapture of Jerusalem. Trust me, 80 years is nothing in history. We feel today that the present situation is unchangeable. There's despair, there's kind of bleakness, we don't feel there's going to be any change. Speak to anybody who's over 75 years old. Pick up your phone, call your grandparents. They lived at a time when there was a state of Palestine and there was no Israel. It's only 75 years. Do not be fooled by the rigidness of dates and think that, with Allah, things can change very, very quickly. Imad Zeni, yes, of course, he was the first person to say enough is enough. It took 30, 40 years. Edessa, his great victory was Edessa. It was the first Latin kingdom to fall. And this was the first revanche. This is the kind of counter-crusade. But boy, was he brutal. What he did to Edessa, he showed no mercy. He showed no mercy. He was a man, and of course he built no madrasas, and that's another issue. Both Nuruddin and Salahuddin were real products of the Sunni revival. Imad Zeni, a great hero, and if we had him today, I think, my God, he showed a different face of the revival. Probably as important, but less, I don't know if merciful is the right word. Here's a violent man.
Just one thing, as a disclaimer, I'm not sanctioning his...
No. He's a great hero, but I mean, why should do that?
No, I mean, one of the reasons why Damascus allied with the Franks was because Imad al-Din was just not following through with some of his promises when he was dealing with other Muslims as well. But one of the points was sometimes you just need a sequence of figures or events in order for things to change. And inshallah, with Allah's will, things can change overnight. But like Dr. Azzam was saying, 20 years, 30 years is a very, very small blip when it comes to history as a whole.
I'm going to ask a few more questions, and then I'll ask people to prepare, inshallah, think your questions through what you might want to ask. I want to focus in on this idea of realpolitik, political pragmatism, Salahuddin Ayubi specifically. You spoke, Imad Zeni, for example, is not a nice guy, but he's very important and he's critical. He needs to be there to do what he does. And even I read, I don't know, you can correct me, that there were commanders from the family of Salahuddin Ayubi who may not have been the most practicing Muslims. Some of them used to drink, some of them used to indulge in other practices that weren't so good, but when it came to fighting the Crusaders on the battlefield, there was nobody else you'd rather put a sword in the hand of. We spoke before about the fact that Salahuddin Ayubi spends so much time as a Grand Vizier for the Fatimid Shia Caliph in Cairo. And so he accepts the political authority, at least in appearance, of the Shia with, I'm assuming, he has this long vision in mind on what he wants to achieve. And though Dr. Azzam mentioned it's been overblown, and you did overblow it in the office before when we were speaking, that the rift between Nuruddin Zengi and Salahuddin, that's again something that literally before Nuruddin Zengi passes away, they are on the verge of war, right? From what you're right, they're about to fight with each other. These two amazing, very pious, very religious figures who want the conquest, the liberation of Jerusalem, are about to fight each other, and then Nuruddin Zengi, Allah yarhamhu, passes away. So I don't know if that's something we can pick up on, this theme that history sometimes, for the greater good, things are quite messy and they don't go the way that you expect them to.
Things are extremely messy. And look, as Muslims, our messiness starts from the very beginning. I mean, if we're being honest, none of us have any ill will, any negative perception of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Even though they fought wars with each other. None of us have any ill will towards many of the early Muslims, Imam Ahmad and Abu Hanifa. Imam Ahmad did not have a particularly positive assessment of Imam Abu Hanifa, right? There were Hanafis who were involved in the mihna against Imam Ahmad. I mean, history is just littered with examples where extremely great personalities, who later generations recognize as great personalities and great religious figures, that they sometimes don't always get along, and the road to success, or the road to the Sunni revival, or the Sunni ascension, or whatever you want to call it, is riddled with sometimes bodies along the way, which no one, we don't say something that's wrong is right, but we understand that this is how history tends to sometimes unfold. With Nuruddin's death in 1174, I mean, we don't know what would have happened if he had lived. Would he have gone to war with Salahuddin? Would they have fought a battle but then reconciled shortly afterwards, as was quite common back in the day? But yes, there was some tension between them. I mean, there's at least enough tension that there's speculation. If you read Salahuddin's condolence letter to Amalric after the death of Baldwin, and he becomes the king of Jerusalem, he calls Baldwin, he's the Hafid of Jerusalem, and he calls Amalric Al-Malik Al-Adil, which is kind of a title. This happened around 1170, 1171. Some people say these are just diplomatic courtesies that you extend to people during that time. Other people were saying that basically he wanted to appease the Franks because Salahuddin had ambitions in Syria. He knew he had to unite. And so there are moments in the lives of these people which, I guess when we're looking at it, we say to ourselves, well,
I wouldn't have done that.
Religiously, maybe, there's a little bit of a question mark over this. And it's not like Salahuddin's aides didn't sometimes recognize this. I mean, they advised him, like I said, Al-Qadi al-Fadl advised him that, 1183, we've taken Aleppo, let's focus on Jerusalem now and not fighting the other Muslims. And to Salahuddin's credit, he took that nasiha on board. And that's the merit of surrounding yourself with people who do have this religious grounding, as Dr. Azzam is mentioning. But throughout the careers of Nuruddin, throughout the careers of Salahuddin, you find them, they're engaging in, treaties with the Franks. Salahuddin has a treaty with Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. He strikes that. These are people who understand politics and the world of politics and what's required in order to have some level of political success. And so I think there's a lesson for us to learn in this, in this context. I don't want to mention any specific rulers, but I'm always kind of surprised at the way people treat Erdogan sometimes, like he's a sellout because of what he's doing right now. Even though, for all intents and, anyone who's looking at Turkey, again, a lot of people, if you were born in the year 2000, 2005 or whatever, and you're now a full-blooded man or woman who's very passionate about the cause and condemning X, Y, and Z, you don't understand. You do not see Turkey in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s, and you do not see what Islam looked like back then, and you do not see the turnaround that someone like Erdogan has initiated in that particular region, and you do not see how the ulama in Syria and Turkey, how they view him. Because some of us have asked people the question, the ulama in that region about Erdogan and his approach to Turkey and his approach to Israel and X, Y, and Z. And they say, look, the madrasa that I'm in right now, the religious activities that I'm engaged in right now, would have been impossible without this person's presence. And so, are we thrilled about some of his political decisions? No. Are some of them maybe to preserve his own power? Yes, that's what all politicians kind of do. But when assessing people, you kind of have to see the whole and complete picture before you say, well, he should just fly a bunch of airplanes into Israel without any real chance of success, and the Turkish lira is completely collapsing right now, and they have all sorts of economic woes and X, Y, and Z. So I just think that when you look at politicians, I think the ulama, even though they were a moral voice, they always had kind of a pragmatic, relationship with them as well. So we don't compromise the truth, but we recognize the world for what it is, I think.
Yeah,
Again, I'm not part of Erdogan's party or anything. I'm just mentioning some sentiments that I feel.
what I like about Salahuddin is less so the saintly image and the messiness of the man. He was just a person who was surrounded by people who, throughout their life, there's a humanity to them. And, one can adopt this of holier than thou attitude and read history backwards and say he was a saint and all that. Of course, you judge Salahuddin when he's 20s or at the end of his life. How does in maturity his character changes? One of his main ambitions in life would have been to establish a dynasty. He trusted the people around him, his brothers, his nephews. He wanted to have a dynasty. He did not see this in any way as in any way contradicting the capture of Jerusalem. Would he have gone to war with Nuruddin? Probably not. He would have probably had to hand over because Nuruddin was the main power. But the messiness of the people, when you read the letters of these people, when you look at their court, they're human beings. His nephew, Taqiyuddin, one of his great generals, the man who used to lead the right wing of his cavalry, was Taqiyuddin ibn Umar, his nephew. A man who fought with Salahuddin again and again and again, relentlessly. At the height of the jihad, writes a letter to his uncle and says, enough jihad, let's go to Aleppo. He said the dancing girls of Aleppo are absolutely gorgeous. Let's have a few drinks, let's relax. Why are we fighting this jihad? And this is, letters between them. When you look at the poetry that was being recited in the court of Salahuddin, some of it was very, very risque. This was real, these were real tough men. But these are the kind of men who would literally put on their sword and go and fight to the death. So to paint this kind of idealistic, otherworldly character does not do service to their courage and their weakness and the fact that they were constantly trying to improve themselves. Realpolitik, absolutely. Salahuddin was a master of realpolitik. He did not upset people, he kept people on his side. And there's just one very quick story. When he became vizier at a very young age, he was of course not meant to be the vizier. His uncle Shirkuh died. And there were so many people who were competing against him who wanted to be the vizier. Muslims, Kurds as well, with him. And several of them said, we will never serve under Yusuf. His name was Yusuf, Salahuddin, of course, Yusuf. And they left Egypt and they did not serve with him. And one of them remains, and then we fast forward until Richard the Lionheart. And there was a time, as like Salman said, Richard was an incredible soldier. He was a far more formidable military man than Salahuddin, and he beat Salahuddin all the way down the coast. And there was a point where Salahuddin realized he had one choice, and this is the Salahuddin that we now know, in his 50s, mature. He knew, as he was being pushed back by Richard, that he had a choice. He could retreat to Egypt, knowing that Richard would never reach him in Egypt, because the lines of supply would never allow Richard to reach Egypt. But that would mean surrendering Jerusalem. And at that point he said, no, I will not surrender Jerusalem. I would rather die than surrender Jerusalem. This is the Salahuddin who started off as, some would say, realpolitik and spendthrift and, whatever it is. So he goes to Jerusalem, he tears down the walls of Ascalon in order to make sure that it's rendered harmless. He goes to Jerusalem, he poisons the wells, he sits there. And there's this very beautiful beautiful scene written by Ibn Shaddad, his biographer, where he's sitting there with his closest companions now, and they're all completely convinced that Jerusalem was going to fall, and this was it. They're going to meet, they're going to fight to the death. And they're all completely silent. Each one was lost in his thought. And Ibn Shaddad very eloquently says, they were so still that birds could have perched on their heads. And then Salahuddin speaks. And this is really the summation. When he says to them, I have made a decision. I will not surrender Jerusalem. I will fight and die for Jerusalem. And then the man who years earlier had sworn never to have served Yusuf and said, I will never serve you, and he wanted to be vizier, stands up and says, I will die with you here. At that point, the Salahuddin that has emerged in his full glory is a man who has, do not forget, Salahuddin when he dies penniless. The most powerful man who controlled Syria, Egypt, parts of Iraq, Yemen, into North Africa. He controlled the routes to the Hajj, who could have easily gone back and lived in Egypt and ruled Egypt, and Egypt in itself was a huge empire on its own. Died completely penniless, that in fact was Al-Qadi al-Fadil who had to pay for the shroud. It was the same Salahuddin who, Qadi al-Fadil, who was the embodiment of realpolitik of Qadi al-Fadil. He was a hunchback, and they used to make so much, you should see the vulgar poetry about Qadi al-Fadil to make you blush how harsh they were against him. He's the one who stood by Salahuddin. He's the one who took Salahuddin's hand when Salahuddin was ill and said, enough. And Salahuddin vowed, I will now, if Allah makes me recover, I will fight. And within a year, he had recovered Jerusalem. It was Al-Qadi al-Fadil who never told Salahuddin how much money there was in the treasury, because he knew that if Salahuddin had any money in the treasury, he'd spend it on giving it away to the poor and the charity. So he'd never tell him, because he was a sharp Palestinian who knew exactly how. And this was realpolitik. This was the time when people would come to Salahuddin, and whatever they asked, he would give, and he would be worn down by it. And there are so many stories of sitting in court. And they used to have the majlis, this kind of idea of a majlis, and anybody could come in and ask for something. But if you're the Sultan, every great person in history has been a master of realpolitik, of diplomacy, of absolutely brilliance. When Renaud Chatillon, the great nemesis of Salahuddin, decides quite outlandishly, to attack Medina. Yeah. And he had this incredible harebrained idea of going to Medina and attacking Medina and capturing the body of the Prophet ﷺ. Can you imagine if this had happened? And Salahuddin at that time was fighting in northern Iraq, and his brother Adil, who was actually the one who was ruling in his place, and he kept sending Salahuddin notifications that this man was getting closer and closer to Medina. And eventually they stopped the attack and they captured the people. And Salahuddin sends a letter to his brother, says, put them to death for what they've done. And Salahuddin's brother writes back and says, I cannot put them to death, because before they actually surrendered, we gave them the option of surrender. And once we did that, by law, and I can explain that, they gave them quarter. And if you give somebody quarter, you cannot then put them to death. And then there was these letters going back and forth saying, Salahuddin had to put them to death because he was the ruler. If he let these people go, can you imagine how embarrassing it would have been for him? But by Islamic law, they could not be put to death. They were put to death. And they found a way out by saying, well, if they were left to be alive, then they would have told others the way to Medina, so maybe it's best. So here's a beautiful example of Muslims arguing the law, but realpolitik kind of turning shoulder, twisting an arm here and there. It's very subtle, it's very intelligent, it's very worldly. And we should never forget that we are in this world. We have to deal with realpolitik. And I think, what Salman is saying, this naive perception that if we're just good Muslims, that somehow things are going to work. No, the world is a dirty place, and we need to play the rules of politics. And Salahuddin espoused that brilliantly.
I'll ask one final question, and then I'll go to the audience. I think it's a nice question. Well, I do. I think all my questions are nice questions. But this one, I think, is a good one to finish on, especially with what we spoke about, realpolitik, messiness of situations, making difficult decisions. But I think maybe now would be a chance to talk about the otherworldliness of Salahuddin on that as a finishing note before we open up, to say, what was it about him that all the men who were around him, Muslim, non-Muslim alike, fell in love with the man? What was it that made everybody adore him? Even Christians afterwards would speak about the honor and the chivalry of this man, Yusuf Salahuddin. So what was it? What was that special something that he had?
At its most profound level, and I'll talk about its most profound level in a second, but the Latin historians, William of Tyre, noticed Salahuddin when he was a young man. He was a contemporary. And he said, this man is not like the others. He cannot be bought. Astonishingly, one of the great factors of Salahuddin's success was that he did what he said he'd do. He went straight down the middle. And it was an age where nothing went down the middle, where every permutation was so cynically manipulated. He gave his word, he maintained his word. His acts of chivalry with Richard are incredibly well known. When in one of the famous battles with Richard, Richard's horse was killed and the King of England fell on the ground. And of course the capture of Richard would have ended any conflict. Salahuddin, when he heard that, immediately sent 2 horses, because he said it's not befitting for a king to fight on foot. When Richard was ill, of course, the famous stories of sending him, sherbet and all that. He was a magnanimous man, he was a virtuous man. The greatest legacy that Salahuddin did was, of course, his actions after the fall of Jerusalem. The massacres of the First Crusade were forgotten, and he gave amnesty. But why? The most profound answer to your question is this. Everything that Salahuddin did was an emulation of the Prophet. That's all he did. He was a living embodiment of what he believed to the best of his abilities were the actions that were. And this in itself was extremely profound, because as the Christians met him, there's this remarkable story where one of the Christian women, Frank's woman, loses her baby in a conflict, in a skirmish. And she can't find her baby. He's a 2-year-old baby, and she's absolutely, panic-stricken. And she goes around the Frankish camp, the Franks, the French, I call them. And you know what they say to her? They say to her, if you want to find this baby of yours, go and ask Salahuddin to help you. They knew he was an honored man. And he did. She went and they found. He was a remarkable man. But he was a remarkable man because of the example of the Prophet. Now, when the Christians came across this, they could not admit that. Because if they were to admit that, then the implications of that are profound. So they had to respect, they could not deny his chivalry, but they could not accept the logical outcome of that chivalry. And of course, this is personified in when Dante's Divine Comedy writes about Salahuddin. He places him in a circle which is higher than the Prophet, because he saw Salahuddin as a greater. But he places him in a place which, of course, Salahuddin is not going to go to heaven because he's not a Christian. So he places him with the ancients of, like Achilles and the Greek heroes, because somehow they could not deny his chivalry. He was so chivalrous, he was so valiant that they could not deny it. But they could not accept that this chivalry originated from his Islamic belief. I'm sure Dr. Salman has a few comments on that. Yeah.
I fully agree with what Dr. Azzam has said. I think that every single human being has certain decisive moments in his life in which he's asked to make specific decisions which will define his future. And I think all such meaningful, decisive events in the life of Salahuddin, he made the right decision. When it came to the nasiha that he got from Al-Qadi al-Fadil to focus on Jerusalem, he took it. When it came to his entry into Jerusalem and what he could have done with the people over there, he took the right decision. When it came to when Richard the Lionheart was coming to Jerusalem and everyone was despairing about the fact that Jerusalem would fall again, he took the right action. all of his realpolitik, all of the other decisions that people might have problem with are all overshadowed by these particular moments where the religious sentiment with which he was nurtured by all the people around him eventually came to the fore and ended up making a decision that Muslims could be proud of and that could leave an enduring legacy for him. And I think this is relevant for us today because one of the greatest things I find about some of these, the warrior class like Salahuddin, if we can call him that, warrior political class, is when Salahuddin's engaged in there's a lot of bloodshed that's going around, right? These are people Salahuddin did not tolerate the Templars. Whenever he would get the Templars as hostage, there was no forgiveness for them because of what they were doing, what they had done. But there's a certain dignity even in the act of killing and even in the act of war that people like Salahuddin imbibed within themselves. Their mindset and their approach, it wasn't just of vengeance and agitation. And I think today maybe we live very understandably, our approach seems to kind of lack that. Whenever I think about it, I think there's some element of ihsan that's lacking in the way our agitation sometimes expresses itself. And we all have to look at ourselves individually to find out what particular deficiency we have. Why do we appear more like the rabble than we do the dignified warrior? But I think Salahuddin was the dignified, upright, chivalrous warrior, and that's what made him so admirable to so many people. And his legacy with Jerusalem, just the contrast between the way the Crusaders came in and then the way Jerusalem was reoccupied, was such a stark contrast in the minds of people that you couldn't do anything. And even the people who were in Jerusalem at the time couldn't do anything but voiced a whole lot of praise on Salahuddin and what he was doing. So I think in our own approach to Jerusalem, even in our approach to non-Muslims, in our approach to our fellow Muslims who might be in disagreement with us, I think there's a certain level of ihsan that we need to imbibe in ourselves, where we're just not just a bunch of agitated rabble-rousers who are, making YouTube videos every day in response to X or Y or Z, or posting on Twitter or whatever it is. Look, posting on Twitter is not a brave act. Me telling you right now that Israel is genocidal and they're killing and, they're apartheid, X, Y, and Z, is not a brave act because none of you need convincing of that. I'm speaking to the base. Saying something that everyone in front of you believes is not an act of bravery. And for us to delude ourselves into thinking that just because I can go in front of my base or go on this, anonymous platform called Twitter or go on YouTube and just say a bunch of words about Palestine and that makes me a great mujahid. No, it does not make me a great mujahid. It does not make any of us a great mujahid. We need to learn what it means to make sacrifices, for Islam, on our personal level and on a more communal level. And someone like Salahuddin, the penniless person, is giving us an example of what exactly it means to make a sacrifice with your body, with your wealth, with your time, with your mental capacity as well. And I think that's one of the lessons that we can learn from him, inshallah.
If I could just add that when one talks about Salahuddin's gentleness and his valor, his chivalry and his kindness, one often forgets his heroic military qualities. Imagine if you cannot rule what he ruled. You had the toughest people in Iraq and Syria and Egypt, the warriors, the generals, the warlords, all with their own ambitions. You cannot rule these people unless you had a rigor inside you. And the fact that he managed to control this rigor, and as Salman says, it comes out when he sees the Templars, he didn't spare them. There were days when his anger was such that even his own camp would not get close to him because he would not show mercy. So do not be fooled by a gentle character thinking that in any way a sign of weakness. A weak man would not have been the vizier of Egypt, and I do not believe in this narrative that he was somehow did not want power. Salahuddin was a supremely ambitious person who wanted to establish his dynasty, who, if had it, would take out a sword and fight for his own rights, and he rode into many battles. So it's controlling the anger and having that rigor while showing your gentle visage is what makes him heroic, I think.
No, thank you so much. I think we'll open it up to the floor. Does anybody have... So should we pass the microphone? What do you want to put?
Is the gentleman back there?
Yeah.
I think
Okay, go ahead, brother.
do you need the microphone or?
Should we do microphone?
Okay, yeah, if you use one to respond.
Or you can do it also.
Of course. And this is beautiful. Last you should read.
And also following on from Dr. Azzam's point about Salahuddin's main priorities about preserving Sunnis and etc., and the priorities for the Ummah at large. There needs to be a multifaceted approach to the situation we find ourselves in right now. How, in my reading of the situation, there appears to be a sense that while every segment of society is kind of doing their part, like for example, on the ground, people doing activism or defending Muslims against atheism and things like that. The leaders of the Muslims aren't doing nearly enough. There is a frustration about that, and primarily because of their power and their influence. So, for example, I mean, not necessarily only militarily, but we saw the case of not even being able to agree on an oil embargo, for example. So, would you have any advice toward this frustration and regarding specifically how Muslims could put a bit more leverage or pressure on their leaders, Muslim leaders specifically, to do more? Is that right?
Simply to say that I'm not a politician, and I would simply say that sometimes we don't understand the pressures that these leaders are under. We do not know the full picture. I cannot judge people without knowing the full situation. It is very easy to dismiss leaders by saying they can do more, they should do more. In some cases, of course, they can and should do more. But if one looks at this particular situation that we're going through at the moment, and I'm an Egyptian, I'm fully aware of what's happening in Egypt. The pressure that's been placed on Egypt is enormous. To whether it's to accept the Palestinians, to the enormous economic and social and political pressure that's placed on Egypt is incredible. And one does not defend or criticize the president in any way, because I feel that anybody ruling Egypt now, even the most sincere person in Egypt, would have enormous challenges that they have to face. This is America and Europe and every country in the world is placing huge pressure on that. And I think the Egyptians have been heroic in their humanitarian stance and what they've done. I think the Shaykh al-Azhar has been heroic in his claim. But I'm speaking about this example. Can we do more? Can we put more pressure on our leaders? Yes, of course we can. We can correct them when they make mistakes. We can advocate what needs to be done. But we simply don't know the full picture. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes. And so I really find it very hard to be able to criticize somebody until I've actually understood what really is happening. You don't know what's happening behind the scenes. I know it's a diplomatic answer, but that's the one I really believe in. I've lived through many, many wars in my life. I've been through 5 or 6 different conflicts when I was a child, and I've seen it. And it's easy to judge, and it's very hard to know what those people in authority really actually are going through.
What I would say is, first of all, I appreciate that Dr. Azzam has experience. Many of us have no experience of what war feels like, right? And again, I was speaking to another one of my teachers from Palestine, and he was saying, he said, war is very difficult. He says, when you call for war, you have to understand you're calling for something very, very difficult on the people, and especially as outsiders, you need to understand that particular point. when it comes to Muslim rulers in particular, the fact of the matter is that we can exert pressure on them. We know that things like the boycott movement has had pressure on, for example, particular corporate entities, and that has worked to an extent. But at the end of the day, as a UK community, as I said before, Sisi doesn't care what we say, right? His political calculations are not based on what does the High Wycombe community think about the decision I'm making, or what are their sentiments about Jerusalem. The Egyptian ulama, as far as I've seen, have been quite vocal. Even the ulama who've had associations with the state have actually been quite vocal on this particular issue. I think when we look at rulers, and I'll just maybe take a different route to Dr. Azzam on this point, I think there are some states who have proven to be quite nefarious in terms of how they've approached the Palestine issue. A state like the UAE, I would say, is extremely nefarious on this front. And it's not just because of what they've done in terms of their approach to Palestine. If someone wants to take a particular strategic approach to Palestine, and they have a broader track record that speaks to some type of interest in engagement with support of Islam or Islamic civilization, then you can give them some benefit of the doubt, and you can hope that the strategic approach that they're taking is based on information that they have or their relative situation in this current context. There are other people who are, like the country that I mentioned, who are very actively lobbying to, I guess, diminish a sense of Islamic civilization, whose tentacles have reached in far-reaching places to undermine various Islamic movements in the West. And so for those types of people, we shouldn't expect anything from them to begin with. And secondly, I think we need to be a very clear moral voice that that type of general approach is not acceptable to us. But if we look at some of the specifics, you mentioned an oil embargo, right? When we speak about an oil embargo, we kind of forget that Israel, for example, doesn't export its oil from the Middle East. And we forget the fact that America is the third largest producer of crude oil in the world. Yeah, and we forget that in 3 or 4 years' time, America is going to be producing more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. These are points of information that we don't oftentimes think about, and we don't think about, well, if oil is going to have an impact on them, what impact is it going to have on our economies? Because our economies are not the most vibrant of economies when you're looking at places as Saudi Arabia, which is running a big deficit right now with its Vision 2030 program. So as Dr. Azzam was saying, when it comes to particular decisions, there's just a whole host of considerations which go beyond what we might know or how we might think, where the course of action that we're prescribing isn't going to be effective. And even the oil embargo is going to get us a ceasefire. It's not going to free Jerusalem, right? We have to make a distinction between that. Right now, we are at a stage where all we're trying to do is we want the fighting to stop. The question of getting to the 1967 borders or getting Jerusalem into the hands of the Muslims or getting all of Palestine for the Muslims, that's not even a question that's really on the table right now. And anything that will allow us to accomplish that is an extremely, I think, long-term affair. And we need to think about it long-term, because if we think about it short-term, then our strategies will always be lacking. But as a UK community, what we need to do is we need to focus on what is it that we are able to do, not only for the Palestinian situation in specific, but we need to see ourselves as we're one part of the jigsaw puzzle, as Dr. Azzam was mentioning before. But we have to be honest, there are a lot of other pieces of the puzzle that we don't have direct control over. And our taklif, or our moral responsibility, isn't doing what we are able to do most effectively. And if we're being distracted by things that take away from what we can strategically do in the UK, not just for Palestine, but just for the efficacy of Islam as a whole, if we're being distracted because we're trying to strategize about how we're going to pressure Sisi into, freeing Palestine, then unfortunately that's going to take away our attention from things that we can actually meaningfully engage in and do. But as a scholar of Islam, the ulama, of course, have a moral prerogative to speak the truth, and even in the context of realpolitik, to be very clear on the boundaries between what is moral and what is immoral. And just because the ulama in the past were willing to tolerate or overlook some of the actions that were going on, does not mean that they were giving it moral license, right? Because we need to be very, very clear about that. So unfortunately, it's not a satisfying answer, but it's an answer that, it's the only answer I can give in the current situation.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for going on for so long.
That was amazing. That's good. Okay, Eddie, maybe from the sister side, inshallah.
How do we take the examples of Salahuddin you have given to manifest changes in today's society? There is a great apathy amongst Muslims, yet Islamic knowledge is accessible everywhere. So what are we missing?
I disagree. There's a great apathy. I think I'm totally against this idea that there's a kind of decline, a narrative of decline. I think if history teaches us one thing, on the one level that we spoke earlier about Islamic society, it's been fragmented and it's been disorganized ever since the Sahaba onwards. So I don't think there is an apathy. I think I have been extremely encouraged by the number of young Muslims who are adapting and learning about Islam, the hunger they have. We saw this in a couple of times. We saw it, of course, now in Gaza, the incredible interaction of young people through social media. And social media has been a great balance to the narrative that we're hearing through mainstream media. I think young Muslims are hungry. I think young Muslims want to learn. And there's an instinctive beauty to it. And I give another example. This time last year, Qatar hosted the World Cup. And we had people from all over the world, from South America, non-Muslims, Muslims coming together. And you know what they did in the stadium? They all started chanting for Palestine, instinctively. Nobody told them to do that. I think there is a tremendous hunger for knowledge, for leadership, to become better Muslims. I think one of the risks is the social media and online. I have very little experience in that because thankfully I was born in an age when this, I learned through traditional, means. I don't know if the risks of online learning are greater than the benefits, and this is something I leave to perhaps the younger generation, but I think there's enormous amount of knowledge that one can gain. I think young Muslims, I mentioned earlier, have a duty to take on a responsibility, not just what I call within Islam, but outside, and talk about sustainability and the environment and how we're going to live as human beings, both as Muslim and of course as human beings. But from what I've seen, having traveled in the Muslim world and in the UK, is the outpouring of energy and hunger and desire to learn about the young. So I don't think there's an apathy. I think maybe it's slightly misguided, misdirected. Youthful energy by its sake will make many mistakes, so the young people will make mistakes. But I'm actually extremely optimistic about the young generation.
I agree with Dr. Azzam. I think that we live in a time where the youth we should always be optimistic. We should always have a positive assessment of the community as a whole, I think. And there are a lot of people who are hungry. I just think it needs to be directed in the right way. We don't live, at least in the UK, we don't live in a culture where the youth are, and this is one of the things that, I'm sorry to mention this, but the famous du'at today, one of the things that I mentioned to them, the nasiha that I've given them is, okay, look, you're a 25-year-old guy, you've made it on YouTube, you're very famous, and a lot of youngers to take benefit from, and we should just continue to build on it. We need to continue to build on it, and we need to continue to inculcate both the ilm. We need to inculcate Sunni Islam as a whole, right? The whole point of the Sunni revival was there's aqidah, there's fiqh, which shows you how to live, and there's tasawwuf, which tells you how to purify your internal. And if any of those are missing, then there's always going to be some type of naqs in your approach to religion.
Alhamdulillah. Just a quick point. Oops, sorry, I keep doing this. Just to add, I just wish young people on YouTube, these so-called sheikhs, the idea of accusing people of being kafir, kuffar, takfir is so tiring. Stop doing that. Have some humility first and learn your Arabic, learn your fiqh, understand your Islam. Be humble. One of the great assets of being the Azhar, I go back to the Azhar University, the Azhari sheikhs, and whenever you meet an Azhari sheikh, you're struck by their humility, because the knowledge of Islam and learning breaks the ego and teaches you humility. You realize you don't know. So when I see people in their 20s and 30s accusing others of being kafirs, I think, just grow up.
Just one thing. Just one thing I also want to mention. This was a phrase that I actually wanted to use in this talk, which is, we shouldn't succumb to a vulture culture. You know?
Copyright.
Which is, and I'll give you an example. And I told Dr. Maulana Asim, not Dr. Asim.
Inshallah, one day.
I told him I would bring up this example because he was here last week, Akhi Ayman.
Yes.
Right, he was here.
2 weeks ago?
2 weeks ago, yeah. He made some statement online, I believe, about, I don't care about the land, I just care about the people of
Well, he didn't say that here.
Yeah, he didn't say that here, he said that in a previous talk. He said the Palestinians, what they care about is, he was making a point in support of Palestine, and he said, he's against nationalism, basically.
Yeah.
And he said a statement that people interpreted as, oh, what do you mean you don't care about the land? That land is holy, that land is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed. And it became like a whole, viral Twitter thing. This is what I call vulture culture. The man clearly had, I have no associations with Akhi Ayman. I don't know who he is. I've never seen him. I've never met him. I've never heard any of his talks or his, YouTube shorts or TikToks or whatever he's on. So this is not me defending a friend. What I'm saying is, any person who has an aql will know, okay, the man is trying to make a point against nationalism. The man is trying to make a point about, the Palestinians want us to be religious people. They want us to pray Salah. They want us to pray X. Okay, he worded it in a way that was perhaps not perfect. You go to the person in private, you're like, hey, bro, your message was really good. I really enjoyed it. MashaAllah, your point of nationalism was perfect. By the way, on this one point, maybe you should rephrase it in X manner or Y manner. That's it. That's all you have to do. But we have been so programmed to just this knee-jerk, just go on Twitter straight away and just start typing, that very basic idea of nasiha, which any book on nasiha that you read in the Islamic tradition will tell you how you approach, nahi al-munkar, how you approach nasiha to your brothers, is lost. One of the things that Mufti Taqi said, I thought very, very interestingly, in a very recent talk of his, like 2-3 days ago, it's a very passionate talk.
The one in Islamabad?
Yes, in Islamabad. He said even about the rulers, he was very, very passionate, but he's like, do not take this, we're not coming from the perspective of mukhasama.
Mufahama.
We're not coming from the perspective of just this
disputation.
Just try to dispute with you guys. We're coming from the perspective of giving you people nasiha. And I thought that perfectly captured what an alim of high repute, an alim who's lived his life serving this deen, he's like 88 years old now, 89 years old now, that his perspective on this, even in the most passionate of his moments, he's able to frame his message in a way that this is not just an agitated politics or agitated disputation that I'm engaged in. And I want you to know that, what I'm doing is just trying to give you sincere nasiha for the betterment of your own selves and for the betterment of our community, and so that we don't go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having neglected our responsibilities and our duties. And when people see that and hear that, they are much more eager to open up, and they are much more eager to actually change themselves than you call someone out on Twitter and he gets completely, destroyed in front of the whole community and embarrassed. And then even his apology then is kind of it might be half-hearted, it might not be as effective as it was. So no, we should start a hashtag, no to vulture culture, if we can.
You have 16,000 followers on Twitter yourself, right?
Dr. Salman for Akhi.
Doctor, what duties do you have towards learning political knowledge? And when we do, what can we do with it, or what do we do with it?
I didn't quite catch that. Sorry.
I think he's saying, what can we do to learn more about politics itself?
Should we be learning political knowledge? And then once we learn political knowledge, what do we do with it?
I spoke for very long.
Learn history.
Just thinking about that, it's interesting. A lot of anger that we see today among the young people is because it's action without knowledge. We have a right to be angry when we see what's been happening and the genocide that's taking place, and so we lash out. We need to educate ourselves. We need to understand the historical context. We need to understand things like we were saying earlier, that though these situations may appear to be permanent, they're not permanent, that nothing in history is permanent, that 80, 100 years in history is just the blink of an eye. We need to understand why certain actions are taking place. We need to understand why people are reacting. We need to understand, for example, why Germany is taking such a position that it's taken. What is the historical guilt that's taking place? We also need to understand, I think, an important point, that the struggle that we're actually seeing in Gaza today is not at heart, as I was saying earlier, an Islamic struggle. It's basically the last colonial war that we've had. The same struggle that the Algerians had in kicking out the French from Algeria, we're now seeing. This is a struggle against an apartheid state, against a genocide that's being committed. But standing shoulder to shoulder with the Palestinian Muslims are the Palestinian Christians, who are also suffering. The Orthodox Church has been steadfast in its support for the Palestinian rights. We need to be able to discern. We need to avoid the rhetoric, this kind of vulture culture, this kind of online rhetoric. And, I don't think you can get clarity and discernment. So how do we gain political knowledge? By becoming a nerd and reading books. And read books. Don't read online, read books. Read a book with its argument, read counter-arguments. Understand how different people have different arguments. Try to understand the other side of the argument, even though we may struggle. Kissinger just died. Maybe to young people, it doesn't mean anything to any of my age. Kissinger was an icon. He did terrible things. He did terrible things. But you got to understand the mentality that made him become Kissinger. What was America like? Why is America like this? Why is France so against the headscarf? It's very easy to dismiss and say, liberalism, they have a choice, they don't have a choice, and we dismiss it. You've got to understand about the French Revolution. You've got to understand about what happened in the French Revolution, the years after the Revolution. You've got to understand the historical context. As a historian, my key to understanding everything is history. Other people who approach from different angles will use everything. So my only answer to that is just read and read and read. And as you read, always believe there are two sides to the argument. So when you read something, read with a certain, if not suspicion, with a certain discernment and a certain objectivity, and question what's being said. And then go check the sources and come back. And slowly, slowly, you'll build a well of knowledge. And after that, things become a bit clearer.
In terms of political knowledge, the ulama of the past, where even Imam al-Ghazali, for example, was very emphatic about the point that this is something that's a fard kifaya, right? Having either expertise to politics or having political knowledge or knowing the craft of politics or the art of politics is a fard kifaya. It's a communal obligation on the ummah, meaning that there have to be people who are engaged in learning about politics and how politics works. And that engagement can either be to hone their own intellectual skills, right? So a person who's in a scholarly capacity, since Islamic law, as an example, does address political realities, then the faqih needs to have some political awareness and insight in order to do that. And then on the other hand, you need people sometimes in places or in positions who can actually be part of the real decision-making political space. And they need to understand in those contexts the history of both the past and the context of the present in order to be effective in the art of politics. Right now, for example, there's a strong push that I'll give you two examples that impacts on strategy. Our strategy for the longest time in the Muslim community has been two-front when it comes to the issue of Palestine. Either boycott or protests. These are basically the only two things that we have in our arsenal. There's a whole literature on when do protests work. One of the reasons why there's a divide between current day activists and the old school activists, and by old school activists I mean, for example, activists in the American civil rights era, is that they said we had like a 10-year strategy in which protests were one part of the puzzle, right? It was one layer of many layers of activity that we engaged in order for our civil rights movement to actually be effective. But protests today, according to most studies, have kind of lost their potency. One of the reasons why they've lost their potency is because they're so easy to bring about, and they're so frequent now, actually, if you think about it. The Iraq War, it generated massive amounts of protests. I remember I was in New York then, and there was a 1 million-man march, and there were quite literally 1 million people there. But it didn't do anything to sway the course of action, because those protests there was no other outlet to actually influence the elite political class to actually change their decisions. Now, the only time you know about that is if you actually read some of the literature, and there's a whole study on this. If you're an advisor to Sisi, sorry to keep mentioning Sisi, then you would know there's a whole literature on the complete incompetence of Arab armies and why Arab armies are incompetent and why they don't win wars and why even in advantageous situations they tend to just lose, such as in 1973 where they started off pretty good but then they kind of fizzled out. There are whole monographs written on the Arab armies and why they're so ineffective. And so I think we need people in political spaces. But those people who are in political spaces need to understand the broader context of the politics that they're situating themselves within. If you, for example, don't understand the two-party system in the UK and the Tories and the Labour Party and how they operate and the deep administrative state and how it functions, then you might go into politics and just become another pawn in the game and not be able to maneuver effectively. If you know the history, and if you know the current layout, then you might be able to conceive of alternative ways of trying to engage, such as instead of Muslims being part of this two-party system, maybe we should just have a very kind of devolved politics where people just stand up as individual candidates. There's no unifying Muslim party, because once you enter the party system, there's specific constraints that are placed upon you and your activity. And so this has been a proposal that's being made by some people, Muhammad Jalal, and others as an example, but these are people who have some political insights. And they have political insights because they have political knowledge and they study these things and they read up on it and they've kept up to breast on current happenings. So political knowledge, I think, is very important, but again, both on the intellectual level and on the practical level as well. And it's definitely a fard kifaya for us to engage in it. And if you want to become a politician, then good luck to you. But it's not only on the national level. Remember,